act of simple compassion, a piece of bread for a starving child, became a death warrant delivered at sundown. His choice to feed a hungry black girl would bring 12 armed riders to his door, demanding a price he never imagined paying. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The wind was a sculptor, carving loneliness into the canyons and mesas that surrounded Elias's small, forgotten piece of the world. It was a constant companion, a presence that spoke in long, mournful sighs through the gnarled pinon pines and across the dusty expanse of his yard. For 5 years, this wind had been his only confidant, its ceaseless whisper a mirror to the relentless noise in his own head. His cabin, built with his own 2 hands from timber hewn on the property, was less a home and more of a fortress against memory. The wood was sun-bleached and scarred, the windows small and deep-set, like the wary eyes of a man who expects trouble from every direction. He had chosen this place not for its beauty, but for its indifference. The land didn't care about the past. It simply was, brutal and magnificent and, most importantly, empty. The nearest town, a place called Redemption, was a full day's ride away, and that was a mercy. Redemption had no mercy left for him, and he had no desire to seek it. He was a ghost here, a rumor the townsfolk might whisper about on cold nights. The man who had vanished into the wilderness after the fire. He preferred it that way. Ghosts couldn't be heard again. He was checking the snares he'd set along the ridge, the sun a hot white coin in the vast blue sky when he saw it. A smudge of color against the dun-colored earth, where no color should be. It was small, still. A dead animal, perhaps. A coyote, or a stray calf from a distant ranch. He approached with caution, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt, a habit born of solitude. The silence here was deceptive. It was a canvas upon which any sudden sound, any unexpected movement, painted a portrait of threat. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was not an animal. It was a child, a girl, lying face down in the dirt, her body a tangle of limbs too thin, too frail. Her dress was a collection of faded rags, and her dark skin was coated in a fine layer of dust, making her almost one with the ground she lay upon. He froze. His heart, a dormant, useless thing in his chest, gave a painful lurch. He scanned the horizon in every direction, his eyes sweeping the landscape for any sign of movement. A wagon, a rider, anyone. There was nothing. Just the wind and the sun and the suffocating silence. She couldn't be from Redemption. No one from the town, especially not a black child, would wander this far into his territory. They were afraid of him, of the stories, which meant she was from somewhere else, somewhere farther, running from something, or someone. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to walk away, to leave her to the land that had claimed her. It was the law of this place, the law he had adopted as his own. You do not get involved. Involvement was a currency he could no longer afford. It was what had cost him everything. He could see the faint, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her back. She was alive. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of profound and immediate agony. He was not a good man. He knew this. Good men did not live like this, haunted and alone, shunning the world. A good man would have died in that fire with them. But he had lived, and now the world he had fled had found him, lying at his feet in the form of a starving child. He stood there for a long time, a statue of indecision, while the sun beat down on his neck. The wind whispered its cold counsel. Leave her. It is not your burden. He took a step back, then another. His cabin was there, a safe, empty tomb, but his feet wouldn't carry him. His gaze was fixed on the small, still form. He saw not a stranger, but a ghost of a different kind. He saw a tiny hand reaching for his, a small voice calling his name. He saw the smoke. He closed his eyes, the memory a searing brand against his eyelids. When he opened them, the choice had been made, not by his mind, but by a part of him he thought had been burned away 5 years ago. He knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and gently, so gently, he turned her over. The weight of her was terrifying. She was nothing, a bundle of dry twigs and brittle bones held together by a thread of life so thin he feared his touch might snap it. He carried her back to the cabin, each step a careful, deliberate motion. His focus narrowed to the small, dusty face nestled against his shoulder. Her breath was a shallow, ragged whisper against his neck, a sound more fragile than a bird's wing. Inside, the cabin was cool and dark, smelling of pine wood, old smoke, and solitude. He laid her on his own cot, the rough wool blanket a stark contrast to her delicate frame. For a moment, she was just a shape in the gloom, an intrusion into the sterile order of his life. Every object in the single room had its place: the cast-iron stove, the single chair, the small table, the shelf with its 3 books and neatly stacked tins. It was a space designed for one, a life stripped down to its barest essentials, and her presence was a disruption of its very foundation. He moved with an economy born of long practice, ladling water from the bucket into a tin cup. He knelt by the cot and gently lifted her head, pressing the cool rim of the cup to her cracked lips. At first, she didn't respond, then a flicker of instinct. Her lips parted and she drank, a desperate, shuddering thirst that seemed to rack her entire body. Water trickled down her chin, and he wiped it away with the back of his thumb, his touch clumsy and unpracticed. He watched her, his expression grim. Pity was a dangerous emotion. It was a seed that, once planted, could grow into a tangled vine of obligation, and he had no room for it. He was doing this for a reason he refused to name, a penance he was paying to ghosts only he could see. He stoked the embers in the stove, adding a few small pieces of wood until a low flame caught. He took a piece of stale bread from the bin, hard but nourishing, and broke off a small piece, crumbling it into a bowl and adding a little water to soften it. The simple act of preparing food for another person felt alien, a ritual from a life that belonged to a different man. He brought the bowl to her, propping her up slightly. Her eyes fluttered open. They were wide and dark, consumed by a fear so profound it seemed to steal all the air from the room. She stared at him, not as a savior, but as a new and uncertain threat. He held out a small spoonful of the softened bread. She flinched, turning her head away, a small whimper escaping her throat. "It's all right," he said, his voice a rough, unused thing. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "Just food." He held the spoon steady, waiting. The silence in the cabin deepened, broken only by the crackle of the fire and her shallow breathing. He was a patient man. The wilderness had taught him that. He could outwait a deer, a storm, a season. He could outwait the fear in a child's eyes. Finally, her gaze drifted from his face to the spoon, to the simple offering of sustenance. Her hunger, a force more powerful than her fear, won the battle. She opened her mouth and he fed her. One small spoonful, then another. He felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest. Each spoonful he gave her felt like an apology to his wife, whose name he never spoke, an apology to his daughter, whose laughter he could no longer remember clearly. This act of kindness was not pure. It was selfish. It was a desperate attempt to quiet the ghosts, to prove to himself that the man who survived the fire was not entirely a monster. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that this was a mistake. Feeding her was an invitation. It was a crack in the fortress wall, and he had no idea what was waiting on the other side. The smell of the fire, the sight of the child sleeping on his cot. It was a door to a room in his mind he had nailed shut 5 years ago. He stood by the window, staring out at the unforgiving landscape, but he wasn't seeing the sun-baked earth or the distant hazy mountains. He was seeing a different place, a small house with whitewashed fences and a garden full of his wife's roses. He saw Sarah, her hands covered in flour, a smudge on her cheek as she laughed, her eyes bright with a light that could have outshone the sun. She was the architect of his world then, a world built on simple, sturdy things. Shared meals, quiet evenings, the solid weight of her hand in his. He had believed that world was impregnable. He had been a fool. The memory shifted, the warm kitchen dissolving into the sharp, acrid smell of smoke. The flashback came not as a gentle memory but as a violent assault. It was the night of the rally. The town of redemption had been simmering for weeks, a pot of old hatreds and new fears stirred by a traveling preacher whose gospel was venom. They spoke of purity, of order, of cleansing the town of undesirables. The target was a small community of black families who had settled on the south side of town, sharecroppers who had saved enough to buy their own small plots of land. Elias had argued against it, not in public. He was never a man for speeches, but in quiet conversations with the sheriff, with the mayor. He had called it madness. They had called him a sympathizer, a traitor to his own. His warnings were dismissed as the ramblings of a man who didn't understand the natural order of things. That night, the simmering pot had boiled over. He hadn't been there. Sarah had been sick with a fever, and their daughter Lily was only 6. He'd stayed home, listening to the distant shouts, the roar of the mob like a beast in the darkness, and he'd told himself it would pass. He'd told himself the law would prevail. He'd locked his own door, a silent, shameful act of complicity. The fire hadn't been set for the sharecroppers. It had been set for him. A warning, a single torch, carelessly thrown or perhaps purposefully aimed. It caught the dry wood of his porch, climbing the walls with an impossible speed. He remembered the heat, the suffocating blackness. He remembered Sarah's screams and then the awful silence that followed. He'd gotten Lily out. He'd wrapped her in a blanket and smashed a window, carrying her into the yard, her small body limp in his arms. He'd laid her on the cool grass and turned to go back for Sarah. But the house was an inferno, a roaring mouth of orange and black that consumed everything. The roof collapsed with a sound like the world ending. He stood there, helpless, watching the frame of his life turn to ash. Lily hadn't died from the fire. She had died from the smoke she had inhaled. She'd lasted until dawn, her breathing growing weaker and weaker in his arms, while the embers of his home glowed in the darkness like 100 mocking eyes. The town called it a tragedy, an accident, but Elias knew what it was. It was a punishment for speaking out of turn. It was the price for his half-hearted attempt at doing the right thing. He had not been brave enough to truly fight for the sharecroppers, and he had not been cowardly enough to join the mob. He had existed in the middle, and the middle had been annihilated. He had buried them both himself, on a small hill overlooking the ashes. Then he had walked away from redemption and never looked back. He had built this cabin, this fortress, to keep the world out. But more than that, he had built it to keep his own guilt in. The girl on the cot stirred, and the memory shattered, leaving him breathless and cold in the warm cabin. He looked at her innocent, sleeping face, and he understood. He hadn't brought her here to save her. He had brought her here to save himself. The girl woke with the setting sun. The light slanting through the small window was golden and thick, filling the cabin with long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl along the floorboards. She sat up slowly, her movements stiff and cautious, her wide eyes taking in the strange, dim room. The fear was still there, a palpable thing that clung to her like a second skin, but it was now tempered with a sliver of curiosity. She looked at him, a long, searching gaze that held no judgment, only a deep, bottomless question. He was sitting at the small table, cleaning his rifle, the metallic click and slide of the bolt the only sound in the room. It was a comforting ritual, the familiar weight of the steel, the smell of the gun oil. It was a task that required focus, that kept his mind from wandering back to the ashes of his past. He felt her eyes on him but didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, giving her space to acclimate, to understand that he was not an immediate threat. Finally, he set the rifle aside and met her gaze. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice still rough but softer than before. She flinched at the direct question, pulling the rough blanket tighter around her shoulders. She said nothing, just watched him with those dark, unblinking eyes. He sighed, a quiet exhalation of breath. This was going to be harder than he thought. He couldn't keep her here. The cabin was a sanctuary, but it was also a trap. Every day she stayed increased the risk of discovery. Someone might have seen her tracks. Someone might have seen him carry her. The town of Redemption was far, but its tendrils of suspicion were long. He needed to know where she came from, who her people were. He was no longer just thinking of his own safety. A fragile, unwelcome sense of responsibility had taken root. He had to get her back to them. He stood and moved to the stove, his movements slow and deliberate. He dished a small portion of the stew he'd made, rabbit and wild roots, thin but hot, into a bowl. He placed it on the table and slid the single chair out for her. "Come and eat," he said, not as a command, but as a simple statement of fact. She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze flicking from him to the steaming bowl and back again. The aroma filled the small space, a promise of warmth and life. Slowly, she slipped off the cot, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She was even smaller than he'd thought, a child who looked like she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. She sat at the table, her back ramrod straight, and began to eat, her movements quick and furtive, as if she expected the food to be snatched away at any moment. He watched her from the other side of the room, leaning against the wall. The cabin felt smaller now, crowded by her presence, by the unspoken history she carried with her. He could feel the clock ticking, the sun sinking lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood. Every passing minute felt like a grain of sand slipping through his fingers. He had to know. He had to break through her silence. When she finished the last of the stew, he spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. "I can't help you if you don't talk to me. Where were you going?" She looked down at the empty bowl, tracing a circle on its rim with her finger. A single tear escaped and rolled down her dusty cheek, leaving a clean track in its wake. "Amara," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the silence. "My name is Amara." It was a start, a name, a small crack in the wall of her fear. But it wasn't enough. As darkness began to claim the world outside the window, a deeper, colder fear began to settle in Elias's own heart. He knew that nightfall didn't bring safety. In this land, darkness was when the real predators came out. The knock on the door was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. It was sharp, authoritative, and utterly unexpected. Elias froze, his hand halfway to the water bucket. Amara, who had been dozing on the cot, shot upright, her eyes wide with terror. He put a finger to his lips, his gaze locking with hers, a silent command to be still, to be silent. He moved to the door, his feet making no sound on the floorboards. He didn't own a peephole. His windows were his eyes, and they hadn't warned him of anyone's approach. This was no drifter. A drifter would have called out from a distance. This was the law. He knew it with a sickening certainty before he even lifted the latch. He opened the door just a crack, his body blocking the view into the room behind him. Sheriff Brody stood on his porch, silhouetted against the dying light. Brody was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding landscape, his face a roadmap of sun and suspicion. His badge was a dull star on his chest, a symbol of an order Elias no longer believed in. "Elias," the sheriff said. It wasn't a question. His eyes, small and shrewd, swept over Elias, taking in his tense posture, the slight tremor in his hand. "Been a while." "Brody," Elias replied, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "Just making my rounds," Brody said, his gaze drifting past Elias, trying to pierce the gloom of the cabin. "Heard some unsettling reports. A family of migrants passing through got robbed down near the river crossing. Lost a horse, some supplies. Said they were harassed by some colored folk." Brody's use of the term was casual, venomous. It was the language of redemption. "Figured I'd check on the outlying properties, make sure everything's secure." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Brody wasn't here about a robbery. He was sniffing around, using the report as a pretext. The town was a nervous animal, and Brody was its keeper, constantly on the hunt for anything that might upset its fragile peace. "Everything's secure here," Elias said, his voice tight. He didn't move, keeping his body firmly in the doorway. "Haven't seen anyone. Haven't heard anything." Brody's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, invading Elias's personal space. He lowered his voice. "You sure about that, Elias? No stray souls wandering onto your land? We've had reports of runaways from the farms down south. A real problem. People getting bold." The threat was unspoken but clear. "Are you harboring someone?" The air grew thick with tension. Behind him, Elias could feel Amara's fear, a cold radiation in the small room. He could imagine her, huddled on the cot, trying to make herself invisible. A floorboard creaked under her slight weight. Brody's head cocked, his eyes sharpening. "What was that?" "The wind," Elias said, his voice hard as iron. "The house settles, you know that." Brody stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. He was weighing Elias's words against the sound he'd heard, against the rigid set of Elias's jaw. He was searching for the lie. Elias met his gaze without flinching, channeling all the bitterness and loss of the last 5 years into a wall of cold indifference. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and that gave him a strange, dangerous kind of strength. Finally, with a small, dissatisfied grunt, Brody took a step back. "All right, Elias, you keep to yourself, but if you see anything out of the ordinary, you know who to call." "I will," Elias lied. The sheriff lingered for a moment more, his presence a heavy, oppressive weight. Then he turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Elias waited until the sound of his horse had faded completely into the twilight, before he slowly, carefully, shut the door. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, his body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. He had won this round, but the game had just begun. Brody wasn't satisfied. He would be back, and when he returned, he wouldn't be alone. The sheriff's visit had shattered the fragile peace of the cabin, leaving behind a residue of paranoia that coated every surface. The air itself felt charged, dangerous. Elias paced the small room like a caged animal, the 4 walls that had once been his sanctuary now feeling like a prison closing in. The silence that had been his companion was now an enemy, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside into a potential threat. He knew Brody's suspicion was a lit fuse. The sheriff hadn't believed him. The sound he'd heard, Elias's own coiled tension, it was enough. Brody would go back to town, and he would talk. The story of the standoffish hermit in the hills would merge with the rumors of runaways, and the conclusion would be simple, brutal, and inevitable. They would form a posse. They would come back to search his property, to tear his life apart for the simple satisfaction of enforcing their own cruel order. Time had run out. He turned to Amara, who was watching him from the cot, her small body curled into a tight ball. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a new emotion, a reflection of his own desperate urgency. He had to get her out of there. Tonight, under the cover of the new moon, he might have a chance. He could take her north, through the canyons, away from the roads and the town. It was a treacherous path, but it was their only hope. "Amara," he said, his voice low and intense, "you have to tell me now. Who are your people? Where can I find them?" His gentleness was gone, stripped away by the raw edge of fear. He was no longer the patient savior. He was a man running for his life, and hers. She flinched from his tone, from the frantic energy radiating from him. I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We were just passing through." "That's not good enough," he snapped, his voice louder than he intended. He immediately regretted it, seeing the terror flood back into her face. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to be calm, to think. He knelt in front of her, trying to soften his expression. "Listen to me. A man was just here. The sheriff. He is a bad man. He thinks you are here. He will come back, and he will bring other bad men with him. They will hurt you. They will hurt me. I need to get you away from this place, but I need to know where to take you. Is there a place you were trying to get to? A person you were looking for?" He was begging now, his own desperation laid bare. His carefully constructed walls of solitude and indifference had crumbled, and he was exposed, vulnerable, tied to the fate of this child. Her small face crumpled and she began to cry, silent, heartbroken tears that seemed to drain the last of her strength. He felt a pang of guilt, a wave of helplessness. He was frightening her, pushing her when she had nothing left to give. He had failed to protect his own family, and now he was failing this girl too. He was about to pull back, to resign himself to their fate, when she spoke, her voice barely a whisper through her tears. "Caleb," she said, "my brother. His name is Caleb." The name hung in the air, a tiny, fragile thread of hope. "Caleb," Elias repeated, latching onto it. "Where is he? Did he tell you where to meet him?" She shook her head, scrubbing at her eyes with the back of her hand. "He told me to run, to hide. They were after us, the men from the farm. He said he would find me. He always finds me. A brother. Caleb. He was out there somewhere looking for her. This changed everything. It wasn't just him and Amara against the world anymore. There was a third person, an ally. But the wilderness was vast, and the night was falling. Finding Caleb would be like finding a single star in a cloudy sky. Still, it was better than nothing. It was a direction. It was a reason to fight. Hope is a dangerous and delicate thing, especially in a world determined to crush it. The name Caleb became an anchor for Elias, a focal point in the swirling chaos of his fear. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was the seed of one. He was no longer just running away from Brody, he was running towards someone. The shift in purpose was subtle but profound. It gave him a flicker of agency in a situation that had felt utterly hopeless moments before. He began to move with a renewed sense of purpose, the frantic energy replaced by a cold, calculated efficiency. He gathered what little he had, a canvas sack, the last of the hard bread, a full canteen of water, his knife. He took a second, smaller blanket from his chest and wrapped it around Amara's shoulders. She watched him. Her tears subsided, her expression now one of solemn trust. She had given him a name, and in return he was offering her a chance. "We'll go north," he told her, his voice steady now. "Through the canyons. It's rough country, but they won't expect us to go that way. We'll stay off the main trails." He looked at her small, bare feet. A pang of guilt hit him. He had no shoes for her. He went to his chest and pulled out a pair of his own thick wool socks. They would be ridiculously large, but they were better than nothing. As he knelt to help her pull them on, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him. The memory of tying the laces on a pair of tiny boots, of a small, giggling girl impatient to go outside. He pushed the memory down hard. There was no time for ghosts. Not now. Amara, feeling the warmth of the socks, gave him a small, hesitant smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it was like a tiny pinprick of light in the oppressive darkness of the cabin. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. It made the risk he was taking feel less like a burden and more like a privilege. He explained the plan in simple terms. They would move only when it was completely dark. They would have to be silent. The journey would be hard, and she would have to be brave. She nodded, her dark eyes serious. She understood. In her short life, she had likely learned more about survival than most adults ever would. As he made his final preparations, checking the load in his rifle one last time, a sense of cautious optimism began to settle over him. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could slip through the net Brody was surely laying for them. Maybe he could find this Caleb and hand Amara over, and then he could return to his solitude, his penance paid. He could go back to being a ghost. The sun had completely vanished now, leaving only a faint, bruised purple glow on the western horizon. The world outside the window was sinking into a profound blackness, the kind of total darkness that only exists far from the lights of any town. It was time. He looked at Amara, a silent question in his eyes. She stood up, pulling the blanket around her like a royal cloak, and gave a single, determined nod. He unlatched the door, a feeling of finality settling over him. He was leaving his fortress, stepping back out into the world he had renounced. He was no longer just hiding from his past. He was actively trying to build a different future, even if it was just for one small child. The hope was a tiny flame, but for the first time in 5 years, it was burning. He was about to step outside when he heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the wind, or a coyote, or the settling of the house. It was the soft, rhythmic thud of a horse's hoof on hard-packed earth. Then another, and another. It wasn't one horse. It was many. The sound was distant at first, a faint percussion from the east, but it was growing steadily, remorselessly, closer. The fragile flame of hope in his chest was instantly extinguished, snuffed out by a wave of ice-cold dread. It wasn't Brody. The sheriff would come from the south, from the direction of the town. This was coming from the wilderness. His eyes met Amara's, and in them he saw not fear, but a dawning, terrible recognition. The sound of the approaching horses was a drumbeat, counting down the final seconds of Elias's fragile world. He slammed the door shut and threw the heavy wooden bar across it, a futile gesture against the coming storm. The sound was much closer now, a rhythmic thunder that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the cabin. It wasn't the clumsy, disorganized approach of a town posse. This was different. It was measured, disciplined, confident. He grabbed his rifle from the table, his knuckles white. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, for a plan, but all he could feel was the cold, familiar grip of fate. He had run from the world for 5 years, and now the world had come for him, not with the face he expected, but with another he could not have imagined. He glanced at Amara. She was standing by the cot, her body rigid, her face pale in the gloom. The look of recognition in her eyes had deepened into a certainty that chilled him to the bone. She knew who was coming. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the crude curtains. In the faint starlight, he could see them, dark shapes moving with a fluid grace fanning out to surround the cabin. They were silhouettes, riders on horseback, their forms blending with the night. They were not a chaotic mob. They moved with the quiet efficiency of a hunting party closing in on its prey. They carried rifles, the long barrels catching the faint starlight like slivers of ice. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 10, 11, 12. 12 riders. An impossible number. A small army. This wasn't Brody and his deputies. This was something else entirely. They came to a halt, forming a loose, menacing circle around his small patch of land. For a long moment there was only silence. A heavy, suffocating blanket of anticipation. The only sound was the wind and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. Then, one rider detached himself from the group and walked his horse forward until he was just outside the faint pool of light cast by the cabin's single window. He dismounted, his movements powerful and deliberate. Even in the darkness, Elias could see he was a tall man, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with an air of absolute authority. He was a black man, and his face, when he stepped into the light, was a mask of cold, righteous fury. Elias's blood ran cold. This had to be him. "Amara!" The man's voice boomed sharp and clear, cutting through the night. It was not a question. It was a command, a summons. Inside the cabin, Amara flinched as if struck. "Caleb," she whispered, the name now a confirmation of his worst fears. Elias looked from the man outside to the girl inside. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He hadn't just saved a starving child. He had taken the lost sister of a man who led 12 armed riders. And from Caleb's perspective, the scene was damning. A lone white man, an outcast living in a secluded cabin, and his missing sister, trapped inside. There was only one conclusion he could possibly draw. Elias was not a savior. He was a kidnapper. A monster. He tightened his grip on his rifle. The irony was a bitter pill in his throat. He had spent 5 years running from the judgment of one community, only to be cornered and judged by another. He was trapped between two worlds, belonging to neither, condemned by both. The man, Caleb, took another step forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Send her out now," he commanded, his voice low and deadly, "or we will burn this place to the ground." The threat echoed the fire from his past, a ghost reaching out to claim him once more. The ultimatum hung in the air, thick and heavy as smoke. Burn this place to the ground. The words were a direct echo of Elias's deepest trauma, a targeted strike against the fragile shell of his existence. For a moment, the past and present merged into a single, terrifying reality. He saw not Caleb, but the faceless men from Redemption. He smelled not the pine-scented night, but the acrid stench of his burning home. His first instinct was primal, to fight, to raise the rifle, to answer the threat with violence, to go down in a blaze of defiance rather than be consumed by another fire. His finger tightened on the trigger. He was a man with nothing left, and a man with nothing left is the most dangerous man of all. But then he looked at Amara. She was standing frozen, her small hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was torn between two fears: the armed men outside who were her family, and the armed man inside who had been her keeper. She was the fulcrum on which this entire moment balanced. If he started shooting, she would be caught in the middle. His life was already a ruin, a collection of ashes and ghosts. Hers was not. It was a tiny, flickering flame that he had, for a brief time, sheltered from the wind. He couldn't be the one to extinguish it. He took a deep, shuddering breath and lowered the rifle, leaning it against the wall. The act of surrender was physically painful, a betrayal of every instinct for self-preservation he had honed in his years of solitude. He walked to the door, his movements slow, deliberate. He did not remove the bar. "She is safe," he called out, his voice rough but clear. "She was lost, starving. I gave her food and shelter. That is all." From outside, there was a snort of derisive laughter. "We've heard stories like that before," Caleb's voice shot back, laced with contempt. "Stories that end with our women hurt and our children gone. Open the door. Let me see my sister." Elias's hand rested on the wooden bar. He knew what would happen the moment he opened that door. They would see him, a haggard white man, and their rage would be immediate and absolute. His words would mean nothing against the history of pain and betrayal they carried with them. He was a symbol, and they were here to destroy what he represented. "Caleb," Amara cried out from behind him, her voice small but surprisingly strong. "He's telling the truth. He was kind to me." The girl's voice caused a momentary pause outside. The suffocating silence returned, but this time it was filled with uncertainty. Elias could feel Caleb and his men recalibrating, processing this new information that did not fit their narrative. He had to use this moment. "I am opening the door," Elias called out. "I am unarmed. Do not shoot." He took another breath, a prayer to a God he no longer believed in, and lifted the heavy bar. The wood scraped against the frame, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. He pulled the door inward, stepping back into the gloom of the cabin, his hands raised slightly to show they were empty. Caleb stood framed in the doorway, a tall, imposing figure against the night sky. His eyes, hard and angry, swept the room, finally landing on Amara. His expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of profound relief, before hardening again as his gaze snapped back to Elias. Two of his men moved up to flank him, their rifles held at the ready. The standoff was now intensely personal, contained within the four walls of the cabin. "Amara," Caleb said, his voice softer but still tight with command. "Come here." Amara hesitated, her gaze flicking between her brother and Elias. She took a step towards Caleb, then stopped. "He helped me, Caleb," she insisted, her voice pleading. "He gave me food." Caleb's eyes were locked on Elias, searching his face for any sign of deception, of malice. He saw only a deep, profound weariness. He saw a man who looked like he had already died once and had no fear of doing it again. The tension in the cabin was a physical thing, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Caleb's gaze bore into Elias, a silent interrogation filled with a lifetime of justified suspicion. He saw a reclusive white man and his sister, and history had taught him what that equation usually equaled. But Amara's words, and the strange, hollowed-out look in Elias's eyes, created a dissonance he couldn't immediately reconcile. He was prepared for a monster, a fight, a simple, clean act of vengeance. He was not prepared for this quiet, complicated sorrow. Elias did not look away. He had nothing to hide, not anymore. The fire that had taken his family had burned away all his pretenses, leaving only the raw, scarred truth of his grief. Let them look. Let them see the ghost he had become. "Why?" Caleb asked, the single word cutting through the silence. It wasn't about the food or the shelter. It was the deeper question. Why would you, a man like you, help a child like her, knowing the risk? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that Elias had barely been able to admit to himself. The fortress he had built around his heart began to crumble, not from the outside threat, but from the inside out. The ghosts he had held at bay for 5 long years came rushing in. "Because," Elias began, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't felt in half a decade, "because the last time there was a fire, I failed to save my own." The confession was a lead weight, dropping into the silence and pulling everything down with it. He wasn't just talking about the fire outside. He was talking about the one that had been burning inside him ever since. He saw Caleb's expression flicker, the hard certainty in his eyes wavering, replaced by a flicker of confusion, of something akin to empathy. "I had a daughter," Elias continued, the words torn from him, each one a fresh wound. "She was 6. Her name was Lily. She died in my arms because I was a coward, because I didn't do enough." He wasn't pleading for his life. He was simply bearing witness to his own damnation. In that moment, he was no longer a white man or a threat. He was just a father who had lost a child. This was a language Caleb, in his desperate search for his sister, Understood perfectly. The shared grief of parental or fraternal terror was a bridge across the racial chasm that separated them. Amara, sensing the shift, ran to her brother's side, grabbing his hand. "It's true," she said, looking up at him. "He was sad. He gave me his socks." It was such a small, childish detail, but it was powerfully human. It was an undeniable testament to a simple, unadorned act of care. Caleb looked from his sister's earnest face to the profound, unending grief in Elias's. The rage that had fueled his ride through the night began to cool, replaced by a somber understanding. He and Elias were two sides of the same coin, men shaped by loss and fear, willing to ride into darkness for the ones they loved. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He turned to his men. "Lower your rifles." The command was quiet, but it carried the weight of a king. The men who had been coiled springs of violence relaxed, the immediate threat dissipating like mist. Caleb turned back to Elias. There was no friendship in his eyes, no forgiveness. There couldn't be. The world was not so simple. But there was a flicker of respect, acknowledgement of a shared, terrible humanity. "We'll take her," Caleb said. It was a statement, not a request. He helped Amara onto his horse, wrapping her in a blanket. As the riders prepared to leave, Amara looked back at Elias, who stood in the doorway of his cabin, a solitary figure framed by the darkness. "Thank you," she called out, her small voice carrying on the night air. Elias didn't answer. He just watched them go, the sound of their horses fading back into the vast, indifferent silence of the wilderness. He was alone again. The fortress was secure, but something had changed. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter now. The fire within him had not been extinguished, but in the smoldering embers, a tiny, fragile seed of peace had been planted. He had not found redemption, but he had faced his past, and for the first time in 5 years, the dawn that was coming did not feel like a threat, but a promise.